Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. In this episode, we explore how the United States is rethinking its industrial strategy, from America First policies and supply chain reshoring to the global race for critical minerals. We look at whether bringing production closer to home can truly strengthen economic and national security, and how these shifts are reshaping U.S. relations with resource-rich regions in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We also examine how multinational firms are adapting to this new landscape and why AI infrastructure, data centers, chips, and massive energy systems is becoming a strategic asset in its own right. Are we witnessing a profound reconfiguration of global supply chains, or the emergence of hybrid models that blend global reach and strategic domestic control? My guest for this episode is Filipe Calvão, Associate Professor of Anthropology and Sociology here at the Geneva Graduate Institute. Filipe, thank you very much for joining us on this episode of What Matters Today. My first question for you is, how would you define the geopolitical rationale behind the America First industrial strategy? In what ways does it differ from previous U.S. industrial policies focused on the economic and national security?
Thank you for having me today. In answer to your question, at its core, the America First industrial strategy treats production capacity as a matter of geopolitical power. Question of rebuilding domestic and allied sort of friend-shored capacity in sectors that underpin military capability, energy security, technological leadership, and so on. The idea is relatively simple. If you depend on strategic rivals for semiconductors, for critical minerals, for energy inputs, you are structurally vulnerable. So the goal is not just growth, it's resilience, it's autonomy, it's leverage. What I think distinguishes this moment from earlier U.S. industrial policies is this explicit security framing. Previous strategies often emphasized competitiveness and innovation, but today the language is about choke points. It's about coercion. It's about increasingly market intervention. So it's less about maximizing efficiency and more about minimizing dependence, even if it comes at a higher cost.
And do reshoring and relocation efforts truly have the potential to reduce U.S. dependence on global supply chains? And which sectors are the most strategic in this transition?
I think reshoring can reduce dependence, but only partially. Complex supply chains don't simply snap back home. What we're seeing instead is selective reshoring and so-called friend-shoring, so relocating critical stages of production to either home or trusted partners. Full reshoring is unrealistic for highly complex supply chains. What's more plausible or realistic is the kind of selective reshoring coupled again with friend-shoring, or in the case of the US, strategic stockpiling. The most strategic sectors are those where choke points can occur and where the choke points matter. We see this in semiconductors, including manufacturing equipment. We see this in critical minerals, including the processing and the supply chains for all kinds of magnets. We see this in battery and other kinds of key components, as well as defense industrial inputs. This is obviously a very relevant matter today. What I find interesting is that the real bottleneck does not often come in the extraction process of these critical minerals, but instead in the processing and the refining stages. So I think reshoring is less about bringing everything back, but more about securing the most fragile nodes of these supply chains. So it does reduce risk, but it doesn't eliminate altogether the kinds of global interdependence that we see today.
You mentioned critical minerals. This is where I want to go right now. So we know that critical minerals are essential for a wide range of technologies. You've mentioned some from batteries to defense systems and digital infrastructure. In your view, what are the major geopolitical stakes associated with their control and extraction?
Critical minerals are, as you said, the backbone of modern technology. We see this in electric vehicles, advanced forms of computation, defense and missile guidance systems, for example. But the geopolitical stakes lie not just in who has the deposits of these critical minerals, but in fact in who controls the forms of processing and refining. So I think control over these stages, the refining and the processing, can translate into forms of leverage through export controls, through pricing mechanisms, supply restrictions. And we've seen how concentrated forms of processing capacity create all kinds of strategic asymmetries. So whoever controls supply, especially in the processing stage, can influence prices, forms of availability, again, export controls, and so on. I mean, just to give the case of China, with the exception of nickel, copper, and lithium, they have a quasi-monopoly over all critical minerals in both the mining and the refining stages. There's also, to respond to the question of the critical sectors, forms of military and technological dependence. A lot of these systems rely on minerals with highly concentrated forms of supply chains, rare earth for magnets, and so on. And we're also witnessing a kind of a state market hybrid power. We're seeing governments, and this is true of the US, act less as referees and more as market shapers of some kind. The US has a heavy hand in a lot of these commodity markets, be it through the International Development Finance Corporation or the Export-Import Bank of the US, where they're actually subsidizing the cost of launching new mines and creating a strategic stockpile, the so-called Project Vault, for critical minerals. And in a highly controversial move, ensuring price floors for a lot of these minerals. Finally, there's the territorial and infrastructural politics associated with critical minerals. Minerals is not just about extracting. They have to connect to ports, to railways, to different kinds of security mechanisms. So the extraction of these critical minerals is also about forms of territorial control and forms of governance. So in sum, critical minerals are not just about supply chains, they're also about sovereignty, infrastructure, political order, if you will.
And just on that last point, how is U.S. policy on critical minerals reshaping relations with resource-rich regions such as Africa, Latin America, or Asia? Are we seeing the emergence of new forms of competition, partnership, or both?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think U.S. policy has shifted away from the kind of traditional aid diplomacy toward a form of what we could call supply diplomacy. So instead of the traditional forms of development assistance, we see infrastructure financing, strategic partnerships, offtake agreements. The U.S. has recently concluded about 20 partnerships with different countries, so 20 different countries for critical minerals. So this creates both question of partnerships, but also competition. So we have the emergence of new forms of alliances in countries like Australia, different parts of Africa, and these alliances are deepening. On the other hand, competition, particularly with China, over the access and the pricing of these critical minerals is also intensifying. So I think it's a moment where we have new kinds of institutional building moves with preferential trade bloc agreements around critical minerals. But what I think it's perhaps an interesting takeaway from this moment is that increasingly producer countries, those that are rich in critical minerals, tend to be more assertive than before. They want local processing, they want jobs, they want infrastructure. So the kinds of value-adding industries in refining and so on, not simply extraction. So these relationships with resource-rich countries have become increasingly negotiated and not simply one-sided. And I think that's an interesting development.
And to what degree can reshoring actually enhance U.S. national security? Do significant vulnerabilities remain, even with partial supply chain relocation?
Reshoring enhances security in specific nodes, right? Especially where a single disruption could eventually cripple an entire system, right? We see this in chips, in magnets, in certain processed minerals, in that they reduce single point dependence, but it doesn't remove vulnerability altogether. I think there's a number of challenges. The first being the fact that building domestic capacity takes many, many years, both in opening up new mines, in creating refining capacity, metallurgy capacity, and so on. So this is a problem of both cost and scale in that domestic production say the case of the US, can and is often costlier. Second, I think even reshored production still depends on imported minerals and imported machinery. So this can create potential processing and equipment choke points. You can mine domestically, but you still depend on foreign processing or specialized equipment that's not available domestically. And thirdly, I think these vulnerabilities can shift from a kind of geopolitical risk to other forms of energy or infrastructural risk. So the policy of friendshoring, for example, can reduce kind of adversarial leverage, but introduces new bargaining dynamics with partners. So I would say, in response to your question, that geopolitical risk does not disappear altogether. It tends to relocate. It's more about managing exposure, but it doesn't eliminate interdependence. It becomes less fragile as a system, but not fully secure.
And how are multinational firms and private sector actors responding to this industrial strategy? Are global supply chains undergoing a profound reconfiguration, or are we mostly seeing hybrid approaches?
It's a difficult question because I think there's a lot of uncertainty in the current moment. It's fairly clear that most companies are not abandoning the project of globalization. If anything, they're layering different strategies onto it. So we're seeing increasingly these kinds of hybrid supply chains, diversification, dual sourcing, having a hand in China, but also elsewhere. But I think companies tend to respond to different kinds of incentives. And when governments provide subsidies or price supports or regulatory clarity, which is often lacking currently in the US, firms tend to follow. They are still cost sensitive and they tend to remain globally integrated. So I would say that rather than a complete rewiring of the global supply chain, we're seeing a kind of selective restructuring in certain sectors, even while much of the global trade still continues. The lack of clarity stems also from the heavy hand of the state in a lot of these commodity markets. So it remains to be seen exactly how firms will reorganize sourcing, particularly when it comes to lack of clarity with tariffs and pricing and compliance burdens as well.
So let's talk about AI. So AI infrastructure relies heavily on data centers, advanced chips, and vast energy supplies. To what extent is control over AI infrastructure becoming a new form of geopolitical power, comparable to control over oil or critical minerals in earlier eras?
If we look at AI infrastructures today, advanced semiconductors, these hyperscale data centers, the cloud ecosystem, energy systems, it increasingly resembles earlier strategic resources like oil or rare earths, data as the new oil. But control over AI infrastructure is not just about economic advantage. It's about military capability. It's about technological leadership. It's about agenda setting power in global governance. I think there's at least 3 layers of geopolitical significance when it comes to thinking about AI infrastructure. The first deals with control over computation capacity, i.e. the ability to train, deploy AI models depends on access to advanced chips, massive data center capacity. This creates inevitably choke points, particularly in semiconductor manufacturing and in the energy required to power these facilities. The second layer of geopolitical significance deals precisely with the notion of infrastructural geography, if you will. Data centers are not just clouds or abstract clouds, they are intensely physical infrastructures tied to land, water, energy grids. And their location reflects not only political decisions, but also regulatory environments, energy availability. So in that sense, AI infrastructure is also deeply territorial. And the third layer of geopolitical significance, and increasingly important, is the energy and environmental dimension of AI. AI models require immense amounts of electricity, immense amounts of water for cooling. And as governments promote domestic or national AI sovereignty, they are implicitly committing to expanding these high energy digital infrastructures, which raises a number of important questions. Who bears the environmental cost of AI infrastructure? How does AI expansion intersect with all different kinds of decarbonization commitments? And are we shifting environmental burdens onto specific regions or communities? So AI power is not just digital, it's mineral, it's electrical, it's ecological, and control over AI infrastructure is also control over energy flows and environmental externalities.
And for my last question, as governments promote domestic AI development and data sovereignty, are data centers and AI supply chains becoming strategic assets subject to reshoring, industrial policy, and national security logic in the same way as manufacturing and extractive industries?
I think so. And I think we are witnessing the territorialization of digital infrastructures. Governments are increasingly framing data centers, AI supply chains, semiconductor production as matters of national security and economic sovereignty. And in that sense, it resembles early industrial policies around oil or steel or what have you, but with a twist in that AI is both intangible, but also deeply, deeply material. So reshoring AI infrastructure is not only about bringing cheap manufacturing home, it's also about securing domestic data storage. It's about ensuring national control over cloud providers. It's about reducing the reliance on foreign-controlled computing capacity. This territorialization comes with trade-offs. Data centers, as I mentioned earlier, are energy intensive and water intensive, and they're clustering in specific regions, often where energy is cheaper, can strain local grids. It can increase fossil fuel dependence. It can compete with other uses, be it for residential or agricultural needs. And in some cases, the push for AI dominance risks potentially undermining climate goals. So while reshoring may potentially enhance technological autonomy, it does not eliminate vulnerability. And it can indeed create new forms of exposure, be it energy grid, local environment conflicts, dependence on imported critical minerals for computation hardware. So in this sense, I think AI reshoring resembles earlier industrial strategies in that it reduces some geopolitical risks, but introduces new ecological and infrastructural ones. And I think the deeper question may not be whether AI infrastructure should be nationalized or reshored, but how to reconcile AI expansion with energy transition, environmental justice, and the sustainable use of resources.
Filipe, thank you. That was very interesting. And thanks again for being part of this episode.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.